Here's everything you need to know about the 6th house in your natal chart. And make sure that you stick around until the end of this video, where I'll be sharing with you more tools and resources for how you can master the houses within your natal chart. The 6th house is traditionally called Mala Fortuna, or the evil fortune, because the 6th house is traditionally thought of as one of the worst houses of heaven. The worst houses within our chart are the 6th house, the 8th house, and the 12th house. And the reasons why the ancients thought that these houses were the worst houses in the chart is because none of these houses have a direct aspect relationship to the ascendant, which was a very important thing for the ancients because the ascendant represents the quantum of energy that we all have within this lifetime with which to live, breathe, and have our being within this material world. Therefore, since the 6th house is having a quincunx relationship to the ascendant, the ancients considered the 6th house to be a house of sickness as well as slavery, things that directly are out of harmony with the fundamental universal life force energy and health that we find embodied within our 1st house. The 6th house is a very important house from a medical astrology perspective because since the 6th house is the house of sickness, it usually points us in the direction of the things that ail our bodies the most. It's important to note that in traditional astrology, the 6th house has nothing to do with health at all, but rather the 6th house has to do with all of the things that weaken and diminish our vitality, a vitality that's fundamentally only held within the 1st house of our natal horoscopes. Therefore, from a traditional astrology perspective, the 1st house has always been the only house of health and vitality within our natal horoscopes. The 6th house is also the traditional house of slavery. And in the 21st century, we tend to interpret that as being things that we do to overwork our bodies or things that we do in life where we find ourselves working very hard but aren't really getting compensated based on the amount of work that we're putting out. When we find the rule of the 1st house in the 6th house, not only does this represent that this person may live a life of a high amount of stress and anxiety in general, but it can also represent that this is a person who puts themselves in positions of slavery and service even when they don't have to. It seems to be something that they just find themselves very hardwired to always do. It's also important to know that in traditional astrology, the 6th house has nothing to do with career or job or occupation or vocation or anything of that effect. The 6th house specifically has to do with our employees or people who work for us. However, what I said earlier about the 6th house still remains the same, that if we find the ruler of the ascendant in the 6th house, it usually represents a person who's turning themselves into a slave or a person who's allowing themselves to always be in roles of service, regardless of whether or not that has anything to do with the job or the occupation that they have in life in general. The 6th house is also the house of small animals smaller than a goat. I don't know why the goat became the measure for what a small animal was or not. I don't make the rules. Don't shoot the messenger. The 6th house is the house of animals that are smaller than a goat. So we usually consider the 6th house to be the house of domestic animals, especially if those animals are our pets. This is contrasted with the 12th house, which represents animals larger than the goat. Something that I've often found quite interesting is that even though the 6th house is the 9th house of our mother, because we know that the 10th house is the house of the mother, very often when we find the ruler of our 10th house in our 6th house, it doesn't really have anything to do with our mother being in a far-off foreign country, which we would think would happen if our mother were in her own 9th house. But it very often also has to do with our mother being in a very high-stress environment or a very high-stress working situation that causes our mother and the well-being of our mother to be a very big source of stress within our own lives. Now, we all know that the 7th house is the house of our marriage or love partner, which means that the 6th house is the 12th house from that person. Very often, when we find the ruler of the 7th house in the 6th house, or the ruler of the 6th house in the 7th house, that can represent that that is a very problematic person within our lives, who wears their problems without shame, completely branded on their foreheads, and who probably represent a very great source of stress within our lives in general. And I've all too often found it to be the case that usually when we have the ruler of the 7th house in the 6th house, or the ruler of the 6th house in the 7th house, that can indicate having a partner who has a problem with addictions, which is indicative of someone having a very close relationship with their own 12th house. The The sixth house is the terrestrial house of joy of Mars, which the ancients said was the case because Mars has to do with pestilences and poisons and all of the things that weaken and diminish our personal health. If we apply our Chaldean order of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon to the sixth house is also corresponding with Mercury, which makes a lot of sense since Mercury was the messenger or the servant of the gods, and the sixth house is the natural house of servants and servitude. From a medical astrology perspective, the sixth house is representing our small and large intestines, and it most specifically represents the three parts of our small intestines, being the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum, where most of the digestion and the absorption of nutrients takes place within our bodies. Since the sixth house is a cadent house, planets in the sixth house don't really have a lot of power to show their stuff within the world. And what makes this even worse from a general astrological perspective is because since the sixth house also is having a quincunx aspect to the ascendant, those planets in the sixth house usually tend to be cut off from the larger life force that our ascendant represents. Therefore, planets in the sixth house fulfill the ancient aphorism that a planet in a cadent house is like a man dead, having no motion. To receive a free sample chapter of my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, set to be published in spring 2023, sign up for my newsletter down below where you'll also gain access to other giveaways as well as free lectures from my private masterclass series. Now, if you've enjoyed this video on the sixth house, but don't really know why these rules about the sixth house being a cadent house don't apply to the third house since the third house is also a cadent house, then you definitely want to check out this video on the third house in which I describe to you all the reasons why the third house is a better place to be than the sixth house, even though both these houses are cadent.